This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Joe Parcell, director of K-State's Risk Management Center, begins today's show discussing what he is seeing for Kansas farm income projections and what could have the biggest influence. K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner keeps the show rolling as he reviews the recent focus on feedlots and what is showing seasonality. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he looks at how dairy farmers have compared to other commodity prices over the last 10 years. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we begin the show with K-State's Risk Management Center's director, Joe Parcell, as he discusses what we're seeing for projections of Kansas farm income. Joe, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks, Chevy, for having me.
And Joe, you and Jenny Ift have worked together and come up with that projection for Kansas farm income. But what is that process that you use in coming up with those models, and how are Kansas experts contributing to that modeling of Kansas?
You know, we've been involved. I guess this is probably going on our fourth year. We do these twice a year. And we're in collaboration with a group at the University of Missouri, the Rural and Ag Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center. And what they're doing is they're building these models that use historical data that we know about from USDA. So it's really good data. And we're combining that with forward-looking data from a national model. So we're tying it back to the state level. And that really is what makes the work we do with the center, RAF as we call it, pretty unique, is tying that together. You know, they do all the modeling. They tie it to the national models. What we do is we come in and we're the Kansas experts. And we try, in the short term, we try to give them feedback on, we'll take last year, for example. We had a really good crop year. We had some, great yields, but also put a little bit of pressure on local prices. So we give them feedback that maybe they need to adjust their prices from what they've done historically. Longer term, we're thinking about long-term trends in the state. For example, 10 years ago, we had 2 million more wheat acres. A couple of years ago, we had 25% less dairy cows. We didn't have canola, corn acres between dry land and irrigated. So we're trying to give them feedback on what that future might look like and what they can build into those models. But otherwise, we assume current policy, long-term yields are the same or trending, and prices are what they've been historically.
What is that importance of those crop yields from 2025 and the American Relief Act funding from 2025?
Yeah, and maybe just a little bit even before 2025, for a statewide farm income, and we try to account for everything that happens in the state in this. We kind of plodded along between 2 and 5 billion. Unfortunately, probably more in the 2s than in the 5s. We hit then the 2020 and forward, we started going between 4 and 6 billion. Pretty exciting. Well, we got to 2025 and we're at $8.8 billion in farm income. A couple important things that happened there, and you hit on one of them. The other, and we'll get to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but we had, obviously, with our number of cattle and our feedlots here, that really drove up what we were generating on the income side. The other thing was government payments. So in that American Relief Act through ECAP and the supplemental disaster funding was critical. We gained year over year between 24 and 25, an 82% jump in farm income. 40% of that was in government program payments. And I would just, kind of remind our Kansas listeners and those from outside of Kansas, that supplemental disaster funding is, some of that's still available. I think there's about $3 billion left of what was allocated. And I think the Secretary of Ag just extended that deadline out to August 15th of this year. So encourage folks to keep applying for that funding.
And Joe, where are we now, 2026?
Yep. With 2026, we're still seeing a slight increase. At least that's what we're projecting, not forecasting, what we're projecting. We expect about another 10% rise to about $9.6 billion. So we're touching on that $10 billion range. Again, with some government programs, we got the Bridge Assistance Program that came in as a result of some of the tariffs and trade wars that were going on to help farmers. We still got, of course, some of that disaster money. But other than that, a lot of things are, at least we're projecting, pretty steady year over year. A little bit of a pickup in cattle receipts. I think, going back to our projections versus forecast, we still, even in our April outlook, we're still looking at long-term kind of trend yields in wheat. I think we're probably not going to see that. So when we do our fall update, I think we're going to see a drop-off, and especially on that wheat side. And we've got a lot to be determined yet on the rest of the crop year.
I feel like fertilizer has been a hot topic too. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, fertilizer is always an interesting one for us. We tried to bump it up a little bit this year. I think one of the things we always struggle with in these models is, how much was bought in which year. Knowing that farmers had a really good year last year, could they have been purchasing last fall when maybe fertilizer prices are prepaying their fertilizer prices when things were a little bit lower? Unfortunately, we won't know some of that until a year later, and we'll have to kind of update our models and see what's going on. But, it's one thing we're attuned to, and I think as we talk about 2026, we really have to think about 2027 and what's going to happen to fertilizer prices between now and then.
Joe, what's going to happen with getting ad hoc payments for 2027?
Right now there's nothing on the books for ad hoc payments, and to us this is a really interesting one, because between 26 and 27, again, we're seeing things moderately across the board in the crops and livestock, saying about the same. The big thing is right now we don't have any ad hoc government program payments on the books, so we're going to see a drop in Kansas net farm income from year to year. What we see there, it's really literally $1 billion question, and we have to remember that these aren't done on a state level; these are done on a national level. Whereas Kansas the last couple of years might have seen about 30 to 40% of their net farm income change because of government payments. There's some states that way over half, 60 to 65% came from these government payments, and they needed that. For Kansas, it really benefited them, and I think it's what we got to pay attention to on a national level is where's the need going to be, and how does Kansas fit into that if there is additional ad hoc payments. But, we all know, we can't forget tariffs are still going on. We've got, depending on what day, there's a war with Iran. Hopefully that's about over, and that'll ease some costs and stuff, but we've got a lot to be determined. And, and we're in Kansas. We never know what the weather is going to bring, too.
How are you guys structuring your models for the years to come?
Our models have been based so far on kind of a midpoint. So we take the averages of a lot of different things, and we come up with an average for Kansas. I think we all know that that's literally an average. We really would like to get to what's the distribution, not just of this year, but also future years. And we're working on building out those models now with our collaborators so we can get distributions of what that net farm income might look like. So, for example, what's the 20% chance that net farm income, what it looks like, or the flip side, what's the probability that we could get down into the 4s again from 9s, or we might even get to the 12s? And what kind of scenarios do we have? I think everyone hopes that we don't have to have scenarios of government program payments, contributing to that higher number. But is there a situation where between livestock in this state and crops in this state that we can get there? Maybe dairy industry continues to grow. Maybe, we've got cattle, we've got additional feed yards being built and stuff. Maybe we can get there. And we have great yields and strong prices because there were some other hiccups in other parts of the growing region. I think from a Kansas planning perspective, especially our associations, our decision makers and our policy makers in D.C., that's the kind of information they would really like to know. And that's, at the end of the day, that's really what we're about, is thinking about how policies that are in place or being vetted now in D.C. at the national level, what do those look like for Kansas, the average Kansas farmer?
Some people might be curious about where they can find more information on these models or see that visual perspective. Where can they go to find that information?
Again, we collaborate with what we call RAF at the University of Missouri, and it's literally RAF, RAFF. Missouri.edu in there, and that's where you can go up to see the Kansas updates. So we supply the Excel spreadsheets with all the historical data and plan data, and we've probably got listeners out there from the surrounding states. They have all our states up there, and maybe it's worth noting the 10 states that or at least the regional states that RAF supports here, includes Nebraska, Missouri, we've got Iowa, in there, Arkansas, of course, Kansas. And then we've got some other states to kind of give us a breadth across, particularly the Midwest and a little bit of the South. We've got Texas in there, but we've got North Dakota, Minnesota and stuff, Illinois. So we have a pretty good understanding of how those policies and what they're doing and what the outlook looks like across those states.
You listed out some of those other states that you're able to see this data from. How does Kansas stack up to them?
Yeah, what's interesting, Chevy, is if you look and we think historically about kind of the value of production, not necessarily farm income coming out of those states. If you take those states, we're in the mix of states that are some of the highest value of production. We're missing California in there. So if you take out California, we've got the top 6 or 7 in the country in there. Kansas usually comes in as kind of number 6 in that group in terms of value of production. What's really interesting is it's number 3 in net farm income of that group in there the last 2 years. And it's almost close to being number 2. It's almost to the point where it's going to take out Iowa as number 2 in net farm income. And, I think that's kind of an interesting switch that's going on there. Again, a lot of that's driven by our livestock industry in there, but we've also had, at least 24 and 25, hopefully 26. We'll see what the end brings, some pretty good crops. So, it's kind of fun to think about that. We always talk about value of production, but farm income wise, Kansas is holding its own nationally.
Joe, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Again, that was K-State Risk Management Center Director Joe Parcell. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll have more for you up ahead.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with the recent Focus on Feedlots report from K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Justin, can you remind us, what is Focus on Feedlots?
So the Focus on Feedlots is essentially a survey that we conduct at Kansas State University of 5 different feed yards in western Kansas. And so we report both cattle performance as well as some commodity prices. And so what's really unique about the Focus on Feedlots is this is the only publicly available source of actual feedlot closeout performance and commodity prices that's available to just the average consumer, widely used by academia as well as industry professionals that don't actually have access to, real-time feedlot data that's out there.
And since there is a fair amount of data with this, there is a little bit of lag in the information.
Yeah, so that's always important to point out. So today we'll be discussing the April 2026 closeouts and the Focus on Feedlots. So oftentimes we're a month behind. So if we think about, just financial transactions in the yard, we're having this conversation. It's mid-June, so here shortly I will actually be collecting the May closeout numbers because those are just being aggregated kind of first of the month to mid-month in terms of June. So we're always a month behind. So we'll be discussing the April closeouts this particular month. Focus on Feedlots, as you mentioned, does have quite a bit of history behind it as well. So we do have 34 years of data that go into this data set. So the historical context of the Focus on Feedlots is always important to remember as well.
So while we're looking at this April 2026 closeout information, what big change do we see when it comes to comparing it to March 2026 closeout data?
Yeah, so as we kind of discussed prior to coming on the air here, one of the things that you had pointed out was there's quite a few lower marketings of both steers and heifers in the data set this month. And so actually relative to the prior month, and you're absolutely correct. So the number of both steers and heifers that were marketed in April is lower than what we've seen. However, historically, coming back to that value of the Focus on Feedlots, April tends to be one of the lowest months for fed cattle marketing within the focus on feedlot data sets. Now, as we all know, the cattle industry is a cycle, right? There's some seasonality to it as well. And so this, those April cattle, that's when numbers tend to be getting lower at the feed yards before we kind of refill those feed yard pens in the month of May, June, and July. And so oftentimes that's certainly not uncommon to see fewer marketings of cattle in March and April. So not a surprise there, but yes, the numbers were substantially lower, especially for the heifers. There was about 12,000 fewer heifers marketed in April relative to March of 2026. So in terms of absolute marketings, we saw 14,400 head of steers and 13,760 head of heifers that were marketed by those feed yards in the Focus on Feedlot data set for the month of April.
As these cattle are coming in, what weight are they coming in, and then how many days are they needing to be on feed before they leave?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things we've been having lots of conversation, I think, in the industry is, as well as here in our monthly segment, has really been this conversation around days on feed. And so in weights have remained relatively constant, especially as we go through most of 2025, 2026, steers, 8 weight to 850, heifers somewhere in that 750-pound range in terms of in weight. But what's interesting is days on feed. So the lowest days on feed that we've recorded in the Focus on Feedlot data set since January of 2026 is around 184 days. And so right now, this month, we're at 192 average days on feed for the steers and 188 days on feed for the heifers. And so right now, our average in the industry is right around 190 days on feed for both steers and heifers. The other item in terms of days on feed that's also interesting, is kind of an interesting discussion point, if you will, is the range, especially for the heifers. So the range in days on feed that we recorded in April of 2026 was 155 days to 212 days for the heifers. So quite a range there of 100, nearly 60, 70 days and days on feed between the cattle that were fed the fewest days and those that were fed the longest days. But we're certainly seeing cattle being placed on feed for longer durations. And, that number has just continued to go up here throughout most of 2025 and 2026. We've seen 170, and I would say the average tends to be selling out somewhere around that 190 range. But we've got a lot of 2026 to go. So we'll see what the future holds for us in terms of that days on feed number.
What are some other data you see when it comes to daily gain or what they're eating?
Yeah, so we can just kind of move into it and maybe summarize some of the performance metrics that we record in the Focus on Feedlots in terms of, so average exit weight, so final weight coming out of the feed yards, we're at 1526 for the steers this month and 1369 on the heifers. So really in terms of those industry trends, we're certainly seeing larger cattle or larger weights and harvest weights at marketing well above that 1,500-pound range for the steers. The heifers, are pushing. We've been over 1,400 pounds in some months recently, so those have backed off just a little bit. In terms of average daily gain, we're around 3.59 for the average on the steers. We're at 3.2 on the heifers, so just a little bit behind the heifers there for the steers. The range there was 3.2 to 385, 2.95 to 3.57 for the heifers. So in terms of feed conversion and feed to gain, 6.4 on the steers, 6.77 on the heifers. Death loss is also an important consideration as well. Death loss was slightly higher for both the steers and heifers in the April closeout here at 1.68% on the steers, 1.81% on the heifers. In terms of cost of gain, we were actually about $1 lower for the steers at 102.03 this month. The heifers was, I would call, steady at 109.55. In terms of projected cost of gain, so this would be cattle that would be placed on feed for the month of May, we're at 107 there. That's about $3 higher than where we were at in March. And then the heifers were at 113, and that's about $2 higher for those heifers that would be coming on feed here in the month of May. In terms of our commodity prices, corn was up just a little bit at $4.69 a bushel. The range there was $4.53 to $4.85. Ground alfalfa hay, our average was $150.62 per ton. Here we are seeing alfalfa start to trend just a little bit higher. If we look at the upward range at 175 per ton, most of the feed yards within this data set are located mostly in western Kansas. And so we all know that's the half of the state that's been relatively dry. And so, as we think about just the impacts of tighter hay supply, I think that is starting to impact those numbers, especially as we may be seeing reduced tonnage from that new alfalfa hay crop that would be coming into the feedlots here this summer.
When we're thinking about those inventory costs, is there any factor of transportation in them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it shows up, but it's really hard to parse out what percentage of that or how many dollars a ton on the hay price, for example, would be associated with higher transportation costs. But certainly, I think there's a fraction of that would be reflected in those prices per ton. And as you well know, just the price of fuel alone here recently has started to increase. So we'll likely see that number start to factor in as we go further into the May, June, and July closeouts here coming up.
And as we're recording this, it's still pretty dry in parts of western Kansas. And so, any concerns for the drought when it comes to these feedlots?
So, if you look at, most of western Kansas and the forage production that's here, with feedlots, obviously some of that's going to be irrigated. We have relatively, there are some dryland acres as well, forage that are out here as well. But to some degree, that does provide us some elasticity in terms of being able to respond to those tighter hay supplies, especially as it impacts the yard here. Will it impact the yards in terms of tighter supply and drier conditions and drought? Yes, absolutely. So it is interesting to see, though. We are starting to see some changes within the drought monitor. Several areas of western Kansas have recently received some increased precipitation. So keeping in mind the focus on feedlots, these are actually mid-May numbers. So as we get into the June, July, I expect that some of those recent rainfall events and then the sentiments as we get into that second cutting of alfalfa that starts to come in, and we may see those numbers kind of change a little bit or soften in terms of that tighter supply that may be contributing to that increase in the hay price.
Where can people find these Focus on Feedlots?
So the Focus on Feedlots is available. You can look at all of the past monthly reports that are out there. We also have a few annual publications that we put out and updates. You can look at those historical trends that are out there as well. And that can all be found on ksubeef.org.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. I will link the Focus on Feedlots in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey.
USDA's latest crop progress report continues to offer its share of notable news. Meteorologist Brad Rippey says among the highlights of the report for the period ending June 21st,
we have our first look at corn reaching the silking stage. The national number is 5% silking on June 21st. That's ahead of the 5-year average of 3%. Our first look at soybeans blooming shows 9% of the soybeans blooming on June 21st, well ahead of the 5-year average of 6%. Cotton setting bolls, our second look at that, shows 5% of the crop at that stage on June 21st, equal to the 5-year average, equal to last year. Nationally, 40% of the winter wheat acreage harvested by June 21st. That's nearly twice the 5-year average of 24%, and it is more than twice last year's number, which was just 18% harvested.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. In looking at commodity prices over the last 10 years, the increase in cull cow prices has been a bright spot for dairy farmers, allowing them to better manage price increases in other commodities. However, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says the slight increase in milk prices during that same period is probably not keeping up with the increases in other on-farm expenses.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the variability that we have seen in commodity prices of various ag products and how that relates to what's happening in our dairy industry. If we kind of take a look back over the last 10 years, for most years we've seen an actual decrease in the Class 1 or fluid milk receipts across the United States. In general, some of our milk is being diverted from Class 1 to other products. That is to be expected with the demands that we have from our consumers and looking for other types of dairy products besides Class 1 milk or milk in the jug. And while we see growth areas in these other products, we tend to generally see a decrease in the amount of milk that's being consumed as a beverage. However, more recently, we've seen some of that actually increase slightly. So moving forward, maybe that'll be a help for us. One of the big changes that our dairy farms have experienced is a great increase in cull cow prices. If we look at the data from 2015, we were getting about $1.15 a pound for cull cows, but then that quickly diminished, and by 2019, we were only receiving about 50 cents per pound for our cull cows. Today, we're probably about $1.70 a pound for cull cows. Varies a little bit across the United States, but still a very good price and over 3 times what we were getting back in 2019. As we look at some other commodities and how that's impacted our dairy industry in the last 10 years, corn currently is just a little over $4 a bushel. 10 years ago, it was just a little under $4. However, we did see a period of years from 2020 through 2024 where corn was very expensive. And in fact, in 2022, we saw corn prices over $7. So it greatly increased our feed prices. Soybeans, similarly, have had a range of prices in the last 10 years. In 2015, about $10 a bushel, and currently we're probably just over $11 a bushel. And again, there was a high price in 2022 when we spiked over $16 a bushel for soybeans. As we look at central order prices for milk during that same period of time, we were fortunate that we had a spike in milk price in 2022. When it came to uniform prices, we were over $25.50 per hundredweight, and that helped us survive some of those high feed prices that we were experiencing. In general, we've had a trend up in the price for milk, although it has been variable, and even in this year we've started out lower than what we currently are and have seen a bit of an increase in milk price during 2026. So, in general, how do we shape up as a dairy industry when it comes to looking at our prices versus other commodities out there? The bright spot for us would be cull cow prices and the prices that we're getting for dairy calves coming off of our operations as they move into the feedlot situation. As far as the price of milk, well, we've had a slight increase, but again, highly variable, and probably not keeping up with many of the increases in expenses that we've seen over the last 10 years. However, the value that we're getting out of cull cows and calves is really helping us cover some margin issues that we might have if we were just selling those animals for the prices that we were receiving 10 years ago. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to keep track of what's happening in other ag markets and how that reflects on what we're seeing in our dairy industry.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.